is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, on her visit to China, strikes a conciliatory tone, saying the United States wants to diversify rather than decouple from Beijing.
Our other headlines: the US economy creates the smallest number of jobs in more than 2 years, and a sign the interest rate rises may be starting to bite.
Ukraine applies to join the Trans-Pacific Trade Group, made up of countries around the Pacific Rim, including Canada, New Zealand, Mexico and Japan.
And here's the shipping forecast. The United Nations gets tough on the global industry, which emits a giant 1 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year. China's Premier Li Qiang says China and the United States need to seek consensus on the major economic issues during talks with visiting US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen.
Yellen says a decoupling of the US and Chinese economies would destabilize global markets. She said Washington wants healthy competition, while also calling for reforms in the treatment of American companies. The Secretary is on a 4-day visit to Beijing.
Our correspondent Zheng Chongying is in Beijing.
One of the biggest highlights on Yellen's agenda today is definitely her meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang earlier today, where both of them agreed to strengthen cooperation to seek opportunities for win-win economic cooperation. Premier Li expressed hope to bring China-U.S. economic ties back on track as soon as possible, calling for more efforts to seek consensus in many important aspects. Yellen also said that the United States does not seek decoupling from China and is willing to work together with China to implement the consensus reached by the two heads of state in Bali. Let's take a listen.
I've made clear that the United States does not seek a wholesale separation of our economies. We seek to diversify and not to decouple. The decoupling of the world's two largest economies would be destabilizing for the global economy, and it would be virtually impossible to undertake.
It's not the first time that Yellen has called for improving bilateral economic ties between the world's two largest economies. Yellen is always seen as a pragmatic and rational U.S. officials. She has called for healthy relationship for many times between the two countries, adding that decoupling from China would be disastrous. So it's hoped by some that her visit to China will get China-U.S. relations back on at least a less hostile footing, which is in line with the interests in both countries. And as Yellen put it in her tweet recently, today, her visit is going to seek a healthy economic competition that benefits American workers and firms, and to collaborate on global challenges. Specifically, the U.S. hopes to persuade China to refrain from reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds and instead increase them at the appropriate time to help the U.S. address inflation issues and to promote communication, avoid misunderstanding, miscommunication, and to stabilize bilateral businesses. We know that China and the U.S. are one of the biggest trading partnerships in the world, and they are definitely vital to each other. And I believe that the U.S. wouldn't definitely miss out these leading markets. According to some experts that I've spoken to, the two sides remain skeptical about whether there will be any major breakthroughs, any tangible results coming out from her visit. But some also say that it's even more important that they are at least talking, which is in itself is positive.
And that was Zheng Chongying reporting from Beijing. Mark Oswald is Chief Economist and Global Strategist with ADM Investor Services International. Great to have you back with us, Mark. Thank you very much. So, de-risking but not decoupling, what's the difference?
Well, decoupling would be outright trade war, if one puts it bluntly. De-risking, well, it's based. I mean, there is a logic to it, as we've seen from the pandemic. There are far too many concentrations of production of a good deal of items in the world, and that needs to be diversified. There's no question about that. But de-risking is also implicit in that is all the issues around security, which is felt by both sides.
And Mark, how would you describe the dependency of the United States and China on each other economically?
I mean, the two economies, and indeed China in terms of the rest of the world, have become much more integrated now. So trying to break away or diversify is no easy task, particularly if one wants to reshore some of the production which has been outsourced to China or to Southeast Asia. It requires a great deal of investment, which the Inflation Reduction Act will help, and it requires acceptance of higher prices as well, because if you are moving back onshore, whether it's to Europe, whether it's the UK, whether it's to the US, your base costs in terms of your worker pay is going to be that much higher, and that's really the complex part or the complex challenge in all of this.
And what would success look like for Secretary Yellen's visit to Beijing? What do you think she hopes to get out of this?
Well, I'd classify this as bridge building, fence mending type of visit, and perhaps the best result would be that there is continued dialogue between the two countries, as opposed to, and hopefully less in the way of unilateral actions. I'm not quite so sure about the latter. At the end of the day, the real test of all of this is how much in the way of further unilateral actions, stopping exports or stopping information or stopping investment bilaterally will still happen. But the dialogue is important.
And what could a healthy competition between the two countries look like, or could the relations between the two countries get any worse?
Well, I think the fact is, yes, they could get worse. One could have a much more, as in the Trump era, a much more confrontational stance. But and that is driven at the end of the day by Congress, not by the president. This is a point which I think often gets missed, that you get a change of presidency from one party to the other. You might see a change in the relationship. You won't, because it's about the only thing that Congress is actually very much united on their fear of China. Healthy competition would basically see, above all, developments particularly related to the energy transition and cooperation in terms of what's still a quantum leap in a lot of cases in the amount of technology which needs to be used, and from which will benefit everybody, not just those two economies.
Indeed. Mark, as ever, great to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed. That's Mark Oswald from ADM Investor Services International.
The Chinese fintech giant Ant Group has been fined more than $980 million for violating consumer protection and corporate governance laws in China. The fine is one of the biggest to be issued against the Chinese internet company. Payment giants Alipay and Tenpay have also been fined for breaching rules.
House prices in the UK have recorded their biggest annual drop in 12 years. Prices for June fell for the third month in a row, down 2.6% compared to a year earlier. Analysts are predicting a further weakening of the housing market, with the Bank of England expected to increase interest rates again in coming months.
Up to a third of flights across Europe could be grounded this summer after air traffic controllers threatened to strike. Eurocontrol, which manages the continent's airspace, says its members could walk out after talks on pay and conditions break down. The staff claim they're being overworked under the current arrangements.
Twitter has threatened to sue Facebook owner Meta over its rival text app Threads.
It accuses Meta of hiring dozens of its former engineers, using their knowledge to set up the platform, a claim that Meta denies. Well, let's talk to our correspondent John Terrace in New York. Well, whose engineers are they anyway? The lawyers are going to have a field day on this. So Twitter's suing Meta then?
Well, I know I know. This is getting silly now, don't you think? This is all a bit silly, quite frankly. Apparently, Threads is now the most downloaded app of all time, ever, in the last 24 hours. Extraordinary, really. And yes, Musk is threatening to sue Zuckerberg and the others for doing this, based on the fact that he thinks some of their staff have been stolen, even though he laid off about half of the staff at Twitter as soon as he took over last year. And there's also an issue about copyright as well, which is going to be very, very difficult to prove. I mean, we don't think he's serious about suing, because in America, if you want to sue, you just sue. You know, bingo, it's done. The lawyers are involved, and what he's done, he's written in high dudgeon. You know, I had to look that up. High dudgeon means, you know, angry and put out. A bit like me most of the time, you know, and he's written this haughty little letter to Mark Zuckerberg complaining. So I don't know whether he's actually going to sue or not. I mean, he might sue, who knows. The thing is, Threads has done rather well, at least on the face of it, because they've got 55 to 70 million sign-ups now, we are told. But you've got to remember something. It is backed by Insta, which has 2.35 billion users. And my understanding is if you're on Instagram, you get a little macro comes up and it says, do you want to link your accounts, or something like, I don't really understand it, but there's something like that. Or you're given the opportunity to join Threads just by pressing one little button on a macro. And of course you want to get rid of this thing because you want to get on and look at your pictures, so you just hit it. And so I think that's partly why they have so many sign-ups in the last 24 hours. The question is, the big question that nobody knows the answer to, is does it have staying power? And Jamie, on yesterday's program, I thought you made a very, very valid point when you said there have been other social media companies that have come and gone, and we simply have forgotten their names now because they haven't made it. The difference here, of course, is that Threads is backed by Mark Zuckerberg, all that money, all that know-how, and Instagram is the base for it. So they stand a pretty good chance. I know that the timing of this is absolutely amazing. They couldn't have picked a better launch date because they're really kicking Twitter when it's down at the moment. And Linda Yaccarino, who is the new CEO, handpicked by Elon Musk, both of them have their work cut out if they're to make sure that Threads doesn't destroy the Twitter business altogether. But you've got to remember, Twitter has 400 million monthly active users, and we're only talking about somewhere between 55 and 70 million for Threads at the moment. So they have a long way to go.
It'll run and run. We'll return to it next week, I'm sure. John, I want to ask you about the monthly jobs data. I know you've been crunching the numbers. What does it tell us?
Yes. Well, for me, you know, Jamie and Paul, well, I was doing this for our Beijing team this morning when the numbers came out. And for me, the thing that really, you know, hit me between the eyeballs was the fact that for the first time in 15 months, the economists got it wrong on the downside. On the previous 14 months, they've got it wrong on the upside. So we've had an upside surprise, and today we had a massive downside surprise, quite frankly. And last month's staggering number was revised sharply as well. So here we go then. So we were told by economists to expect between 230 and 240,000 jobs added in the month of June. We got 209. So that is far, far fewer, and the lowest number since 2020. The unemployment rate was 3.6%. That's exactly what was forecast. The average hourly earnings were a little bit elevated, which is not good if you're the central bank. It was 0.4% in June and 4.4% year on year. And that huge main number of 339,000 was revised down to 306,000, which again is an extraordinary revision. Now, you know, you can spend all day doing this, but I've got healthcare adding 41,000, social assistance 24,000, construction 23,000, and leisure and hospitality only 21,000. They've been keeping things going in the last couple of months. Now, the thing is, some of these jobs, a lot of these jobs are pretty low paying. They're not the greatest paying jobs in the world, but the Fed doesn't care about that. They look at the aggregate overall number, which is still elevated, of course. So now, it'll be a key piece of their thinking when they meet on the 25th and the 26th of July. The betting here on Wall Street is a quarter-point interest rate hike. In other words, these figures, sweet and Goldilocks as they are not quite good enough to prevent a rate hike in July. That's the betting, and as a result of that, the markets are all pretty flat at the moment here on Wall Street going into the weekend. Guys?
John, have a lovely weekend. Thanks so much for that. Our correspondent, John Terrace in New York.
Dreaming up new recipes and preparing old favourites, all in a day's work for millions of chefs around the world.
But one place in California is adding a new cutting-edge ingredient, artificial intelligence. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
At Cloud Chef's kitchen in Silicon Valley, tech creates a recipe for precision.
As long as you see the green, it's good to go.
You know everything that's being worked on in this kitchen and what stage it's at.
Yeah, definitely. I can understand from here.
World-class chefs have cooked their recipes here before. Cloud Chef says their cameras, sensors, and artificial intelligence capture thousands of data points during each session, creating a digital recipe that even unskilled cooks can follow.
Even if you look at the best restaurants that you've gone to, they go through immense lengths of training to just make sure that the quality that you get on a day-to-day basis is the same. It's really, really hard to scale recipes. And the idea is if we can teach computers how to cook, then you can use these computers to recreate recipes from the best chefs from anywhere else in the world.
And now it's time to put the Cloud Chef system to the test. I'm going to be the chef, and I'm cooking sorche pork or mustard pork from West Bengal. All I have to do is press start. Scan the barcode. Dropping in the, I don't know what ingredient that is, do I?
It doesn't matter if I don't know what the ingredient is. I just have to keep following directions.
Using an infrared camera over here to determine the temperature inside the pan. And once the oil gets as hot as the chef took it to, it will ask you to do the next step.
After a number of steps, I'm getting close.
Oh, the peppers, nice. Straight bottom of pan. It's watching me here, huh?
While you're doing this, there's a weighing scale below that's measuring how hard you're stirring. There is cameras looking at the pan, segmenting out where things are. I could see that we were monitoring the amount of fat that's being rendered out of the pork by the camera looking at how the size of the pork is changing over the course of cooking, and use that to make a decision whether or not the pork is done or no. And which is why you were seeing it was asking you to stir again and again to make sure that it has a clean reading of different angles of how this pork was.
Look at that. What do you think? Wow. I am proud of myself. Am I hired?
Each chef gets paid a percentage of the sales of their dishes. And now there's an additional creative force at the table. The recipe for this chickpea dish was actually created by AI, with a human chef adding the finishing touches.
Wow. Very unique flavors.
It has a bunch of traditional flavors in it, but it's unlike anything I've tasted before. AI can look at all of the recipes that were ever invented or discovered by humans and find out patterns from there and understand recipe creation or combinations and pairings and cooking in a way that is not intuitive to humans, but would have taken us another 100 years or another 200 years to discover.
While AI eyes the future, it may also help preserve the past. Nikhil started Cloud Chef because he missed the cooking from his homeland of India. He's even digitized his own mother's recipes, which can now be made exactly how he likes them across the globe. Mark New, CGTN, Palo Alto, California.
You're watching CGTN, still to come. Germany says it won't send cluster bombs to Ukraine, just as the United States confirms it's considering doing so.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Germany will not send cluster bombs to Ukraine after the United States signalled it was considering including them in its latest arms package.
The German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius says exporting the weapons is not an option for his country. Cluster bombs spread smaller explosives indiscriminately over a wide area. Germany is a signatory to an international convention which bans their production, stockpiling and transfer. The United States is not a signatory and says cluster bombs have a clear military utility in combat. And let's talk now to our correspondent, Stephanie Fried in Kryvyi Rih in Ukraine. So, Stephanie, what's the implications for the conflict if Ukraine is sent cluster munitions by the US?
Well, locally, Ukraine has made it clear that they've already been using cluster munitions since 2014. The implications more in the international arena, you were talking about Germany being a signatory to that agreement, and there are 99 other countries that have signed the agreement not to use cluster munitions, and for the reason exactly as you described, being that when they are dropped and when they explode, they fan out, which is somewhat indiscriminate as well. There's about a 40% rate of cluster munitions not exploding. So years later, unsuspecting civilians can come upon those, and that is what happens. And then that can be quite lethal, which is the reason for the signatories to the agreement that bans cluster munitions. The implications as well, it could turn the tide. Right now, what Ukraine is focusing on in what is expected to be announced as an $800 million U.S. weapons package for Ukraine is shells, ammunition. And here the leaders have been talking about needing more ammunition, being short of. We've talked to people in the field who are saying the same thing. Right now they're saying that with this new package, for the first time possibly since this expanded campaign started, Ukraine will have more shells than targets. We're talking about 3 to 5 million shells, ammunition, the ability to have more firepower in, right now, the counteroffensive against Russia.
Stephanie Fried in Kryvyi Rih in Ukraine, thank you very much.
Well, events in Russia over the last couple of weeks are likely to have a ripple effect thousands of miles away in Africa. The private military company behind the attempted mutiny, the Wagner Group, also has operations there. But with the group's future in Russia unclear, so are its enterprises and its activities on the African continent. Our correspondent Robert Nagila reports.
It's been 2 weeks since a short-lived rebellion by the Russian private military contractor, the Wagner Group, in Russia. But with its future uncertain, questions linger over the Wagner Group's operations in Africa. Experts say the events in Russia could have far-reaching ramifications on the African continent. The Wagner Group has been assisting several African countries, including Mali and the Central African Republic, in dealing with their internal conflicts.
Well, they're significant because they're going to impact on certain countries, particularly countries such as Mali, countries such as the Central African Republic, where they've been providing security in the absence of a proper functioning national army.
Only last week, the United Nations Security Council voted to end the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali following a demand from the government. In 2021, France announced the withdrawal of its forces from Mali following 2 military coups and citing the alleged presence of the Wagner Group.
Substantially, people are convinced that the missions have not produced the intended result, which is supposed to be enhanced peace.
With the Wagner Group's future role in Africa unclear, some experts believe this could be the beginning of a renewed push by African member states in resolving the continent's conflicts.
You're likely to see an emboldened African Union. You're likely to see other countries coming in because, certainly whether we like it or not, the destabilization of a Wagner Group has presented new political opportunities for Africa, most of whom have been complaining about the advent of the Wagner Group in Africa.
Later this month, Russia is set to host the second Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg. While trade and economic cooperation will headline the summit, security is likely to feature just as prominently on the back of recent events in Russia. Bobat Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
951 migrants have died so far this year trying to reach Spain by sea. That's the conclusion of a report by Spanish migrant human rights group Walking Borders. The group says 19 boats, along with all passengers, have gone missing between January and June this year, and accuses the Spanish government of failing to conduct adequate rescue operations.
The European Union is drawing up plans for a $1.1 billion aid package for Tunisia. It's aimed at helping the country improve border controls and reduce human trafficking. However, Tunisia will have to agree to economic reforms before accepting the money. Our correspondent Alex Cadier reports.
The European Union wants to build stronger partnerships with North Africa in a bid to get a handle on migrants crossing the Mediterranean. The EU is drawing up plans to provide nearly €1 billion in aid to Tunisia to help boost the country's economy and help on its path to reform. €105 million will also be dedicated to bolstering Tunisia's border management efforts, including cracking down on human trafficking and boosting search and rescue efforts in the Mediterranean. On a recent trip to Tunis with the Italian and Dutch Prime Ministers, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said an agreement with Tunisia was crucial.
Against the backdrop of global uncertainties, it is in our common interest to strengthen our relationship and to invest in stability and prosperity. And this is why we are here. And this is why we're working with Tunisia on a comprehensive package.
A deal with Tunisia would also be valuable for Italy's attempts to process migrants landing on its shores. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is eager to reach a deal to repatriate rejected asylum seekers to Tunisia in order to ease the pressure on Italy's shores. But a recent rise in tensions between migrants and local populations in Tunisia could make a broader deal more challenging. NGOs like Amnesty International have said the country's president has launched an escalating attack on human rights, particularly targeting sub-Saharan migrants in the country. Nevertheless, the EU is pushing ahead with this deal, going even further and saying that the Tunisia deal could be a blueprint for agreements with other countries in the region. Alex Cadier, CGTN, Brussels.
South Korea's government says it respects a decision by the United Nations nuclear watchdog to allow the release of treated wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant into the ocean. Reactors at the plant in Japan were destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in 2011. The plan to release the water has sparked concern among neighbouring countries, with China announcing a ban on food imports from 10 Japanese regions. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency says he understands the concerns, but maintains it's safe.
I think it's logical that people that are not experts in these matters, they see all these tanks full of water. They learn that these tanks are, the water there has some elements there that could be bad, and they learn that this water is going to go to the ocean. So it's entirely logical that there are concerns.
Well, a number of Pacific Island nations are said to be considering their options over this decision to release the wastewater from Fukushima. The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog is expected to travel to New Zealand and the Cook Islands to try to ease concerns there. Our correspondent Greg Navarro reports.
This is a plan Pacific Island nations have opposed since it was first proposed about 2 years ago. Japan plans to release the equivalent of about 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of treated nuclear wastewater that's been used to cool the damaged reactors at the Fukushima nuclear power plant since it was hit by a powerful earthquake and tsunami in 2011. Japan says the accumulated wastewater is hindering its ability to decommission the plant. This week, the International Atomic Energy Agency endorsed Japan's plan to treat the water and gradually release it into the Pacific Ocean over the next 30 years. Pacific Islands nations have voiced their concern about the impact to what is essentially their livelihoods, the ocean, and the marine animals that sustain these countries. The Pacific Islands Forum, which represents the interests of about 18 countries, hired a panel of independent nuclear experts who remain concerned over what they say is the plant's lack of research into the impact of the discharge on marine species. And some of the Pacific Islands, including the Marshall Islands, are still dealing with the effects of nuclear weapons testing by the U.S. and the UK from last century. Now, while some scientists have backed the plan and say the practice of releasing treated nuclear wastewater into oceans is common, the Pacific Islands Forum is reportedly considering its options to oppose the move, including a possible meeting with the International Atomic Energy Agency next week. And if you consider that about 98% of the area Pacific Island countries occupy is ocean, then you get a sense of why these countries get worried about anything that could potentially impact its health. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
You can get the highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, global shipping's dirty little secret and the United Nations plan to cut its huge carbon emissions.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
And welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Paul Barber. Our top stories. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on her visit to China strikes a conciliatory tone, saying the United States wants to diversify rather than decouple from Beijing. And the US economy creates the smallest number of jobs in more than 2 years, in a sign the interest rate rises may be starting to bite.
The global shipping industry needs to up its game when it comes to its huge emissions. That's the rather blunt message from the United Nations. Countries have adopted a revised greenhouse gas strategy for shipping, which contributes both to ocean pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. After days of talks, a net zero emissions target by or around the year 2050 has now been agreed by the UN's International Maritime Organization's headquarters in London. Well, around 90% of the world's traded goods travel by ship. That's 60,000 ships moving 11 billion tons of goods every year. The world's ocean-going vessels account for approximately 3% of global carbon emissions. And countries have agreed to cut shipping's annual greenhouse gas emissions by at least 20% by the year 2030. That's compared to 2008 levels. Well, by 2040, members of the International Maritime Organization are aiming to cut annual emissions by at least 70% or thereabouts. Well, let's talk to Aoife O'Leary, the founder and CEO of Opportunity Green, which specialises in maritime climate solutions. The line is slightly wobbly, but we'll continue anyway. Aoife, give us some broad context, if you would. I mean, how polluting is the global shipping industry? I mean, we're always hearing about cars and how dreadful they are, and cattle and cows and all the rest of it. Shipping, you don't hear much about it. How bad is it?
Thanks for having me. It's pretty bad, is the short answer. You have to think about these giant ships as being floating power plants, essentially. You mentioned that shipping is responsible for 3% of global emissions. And I appreciate in many contexts, 3% would not be a large number, but that's about the emissions of a country the size of Korea every single year. So it's a huge amount of emissions. And this is the first time that there's really been any agreement to properly reduce emissions. However, it's not in line with what we need to actually keep the world within safe temperatures. So there's still a lot more work to be done.
Well, these timeframes seem rather extraordinary. I mean, these dates are decades in the future. I mean, realistically, is this one of those rather mushy UN compromises, or is this really a great achievement?
I'm afraid I would go with mushy UN compromise. A number of countries, specifically the Pacific Islands, who are facing existential threat, really fought very, very hard to get the kind of targets that they actually need to survive. And unfortunately, countries like China, Argentina and Brazil pushed back and said no. So what we have now is a compromise that is just not enough to actually keep temperatures within 1.5 degrees, which was what was agreed globally in the Paris Agreement. And just to put it in context, beyond 1.5 degrees, we're going to have millions of people who will have forced migration, and scientists say that all coral reefs are going to die. So it's really, really just absolutely essential that we reduce emissions now.
We get angry with governments, we get angry with the big corporates. I wonder what we can do as individuals to be more concerned about the huge mileage that our shopping results in.
Well, I guess what I would say is I wouldn't place the blame on individuals. I think individuals can do their part by voting for politician change. At the moment, there's no regulation that means that when you go into a shop, you can even find out what those emissions are when you purchase things. So it's basically impossible for individuals. We need to hold our politicians to account, especially when they come to UN organizations and say that they are defending the interests of their citizens when actually they're not. They are defending the interests of companies and other kind of corporate interests.
Aoife O'Leary, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on the programme. Aoife O'Leary, the founder and CEO of Opportunity Green.
For many years, the focus of many US water experts has been on the shrinking Colorado River. But there's another huge source of water underground, which is also getting smaller. The shrinking of the Ogallala aquifer, the largest in the country, is concerning many farmers in the central US states. Our correspondent Hendrik Sybrandi reports.
With these, Tim Poudler runs a farm in eastern Colorado. His wheat and corn crops are thriving thanks to rain clouds that have been unusually generous this year.
We're wet right now. We've had an awesome spring. Our wheat crop that I wouldn't have given you a plug nickel for at the end of April looks like $1 million.
Poudler, to put it in circus terms, works without a net. He's a dryland farmer who depends on good weather to make a living, not on irrigation.
When Mother Nature wants to be cooperative, we can look pretty smart. We're back the way it was in the 1950s.
Before irrigation became a mainstay in agriculture, Poudler once used wells to irrigate a quarter of his farmland. But when the Ogallala aquifer his wells drew from became noticeably shallower, he took advantage of a federal program and retired his irrigated land, cutting his water use. The Ogallala is a lifeline for many people and lies underneath 8 central U.S. states. Some have compared the aquifer to a bank account. Too much water has been withdrawn over the years. Not nearly enough has been put back in. The concept is known as depletion.
It's just too darn many straws sucking out of a bowl that's non-renewable.
The amount of water use, farmers are major consumers, far exceeds the rainwater that seeps back underground.
Ultimately, the goal is try to sustain this aquifer system as long as possible, if not indefinitely.
Joel Schneekloth of Colorado State University says that's a challenge in an industry that can be resistant to conservation and doesn't always look far ahead.
It's getting a mind change within the communities and the producers. Unfortunately, there are producers that don't care about tomorrow. They want their stuff today.
Some of these guys are just saying, I understand the equation, but I just don't want to quit irrigating.
Some farmers feel they have no choice in places like Texas.
This drought here is the worst in my lifetime as far as economic loss of what we're going to have.
Experts are now looking at alternative crops like sunflowers and black-eyed peas.
Stuff that is very economical, uses less water, which puts less of a strain on the aquifer system.
The futures of rural towns that have long relied on healthier and more predictable incomes generated by irrigated farming hang in the balance. An interstate agreement requires farmers in this part of Colorado to retire 25,000 irrigated acres, or more than 10,000 hectares, by 2029.
It'll be interesting to see how the last little bit plays out. I have no prediction. I would think we can make it work.
There's no 100% cure-all for any of this.
Similar efforts will be required across all 8 states to preserve an aquifer that supplies drinking water to millions and helps provide food to many more. Hendricks Brandy, CGTN, Stratton, Colorado.
6 people have died in a fire at a retirement home in Milan. Dozens of residents are injured, 3 in a critical condition. The fire started out on the first floor but didn't spread to the rest of the building. However, a large amount of toxic fumes were produced, causing some of the deaths.
There's been flash flooding in northeastern Spain after torrential rain and hail hit the region. In Zaragoza, motorists became stranded as the streets were flooded, but there were no injuries reported. Weather warnings have been issued for 5 regions with storms, hail and strong winds forecast for much of the northeast.
The president of World Athletics says London's poor air quality could see it ruled out of hosting major sporting events. Sebastian Coe, who led Britain's capital to a successful bid to host the 2012 Olympics, added that rising global temperatures as a result of climate change may also force major sporting events to be rescheduled to avoid extreme weather.
The Amazon is one of the world's most important regions due to its crucial role in stabilizing the Earth's climate. With an eye on its protection, Colombia has launched the Road to the Amazon Summit. The president of Brazil is attending, along with ministers from 8 other countries that share the rainforest. Our correspondent, Michelle Begay, reports.
The Road to the Amazon Summit is a technical scientific meeting starting today and continuing through Saturday in the Colombian city Leticia in the Amazon. Colombia's Minister of the Environment said in the opening press conference that this summit will host environmental ministers from 8 countries that make up the Amazon biome. Participants will discuss strategies to reduce illegal deforestation in the Amazon and issues like transnational environmental crimes, the rights of indigenous peoples, and sustainable economic alternatives that support conservation efforts. Colombia's environmental minister said these efforts are a prelude to Brazil hosting the Amazon Summit in the city of Belém. The summit will mark the 45th anniversary of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, formed by the 8 Amazonian countries. Why a sense of urgency? Recent studies published by the Climate Action Initiative say the Amazon rainforest is near a tipping point, meaning deforestation could reach a point of no return, where most of its vegetation would be lost and cause a regional climate collapse that will affect the entire planet. On Saturday, Colombian President Gustavo Petro will meet with Brazilian President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva as meeting participants present them with policy proposals and any agreements reached. Michelle Vega, CGTN, Bogotá.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the world's falling population is leaving schools empty. What does it mean for the global economy?
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the live area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
And welcome back to Global Business Europe. Kindergartens are closing in China. The total number fell for the first time in 15 years last year due to declining birth rates. More than 5,500 nursery schools shut down as the number of children enrolling fell by more than 3.5%. And there's a similar picture in many other countries. Italy predicts its school population will fall by 1 million over the next decade. And in the UK, the number of surplus primary school places has doubled in the past 10 years to the highest level since records began. Paul Morland is an expert in demographics.
The first thing you see happening is a fall in the children per woman. But when you've got a large cohort of childbearing women from a previous generation, you still might have plenty of kids coming through the system. What we're now getting to is a point where those born 20 or 30 years ago are contracting in number. So it's not just that there are fewer children per woman, but there are fewer women having the children. And that's why we're seeing not just a low fertility rate, but actually a low birth rate and an absolute small number of children coming through the educational system in China, which of course will work its way through to the next generation of parents, but also the next generation of workers.
OK, and so how significant is this for the education system and the broader economy?
The education system, of course, if you keep devoting the same resources to the education system, you have more resources per head. Of course, society is unlikely to do that. And in fact, it becomes very disruptive. I've been involved in managing schools in the UK. If you have a falling roll, you can't just group the children efficiently. You have to think about closing schools, about busing children around, particularly in rural areas. So the resources devoted per child, that's not a problem, but it can be very disruptive to how you actually organise your educational system as children become less dense on the ground. You have to knock institutions together and, as I say, move children around the countryside in the less densely populated parts of the country.
And Paul, you mentioned working with UK schools. The situation here in the UK is similar, and in Italy, South Korea, plunging birth rates, that's a global issue, isn't it?
It certainly is a global issue. As I've often said, you could walk all the way from the Straits of Gibraltar to the Straits of Johor, so from Spain to Singapore effectively, and only travel through countries with below replacement fertility rates. And initially, as I was explaining, you still get plenty of children, but eventually after decades of very low fertility rates, you start to see a real absolute reduction in the number of children. Now, fertility rates are low or falling almost everywhere in the world. The one exception is sub-Saharan Africa, but even there it's starting to fall in parts of the continent. Outside sub-Saharan Africa, we all have this problem impending. We're all just at different stages, depending on how low our fertility rate has been and for how long it's been below replacement level.
And what kind of policies can governments introduce to encourage people to start families and have children, such as flexible work patterns, and how pricey and difficult is that kind of legislation to introduce?
Well, first of all, the jury is out. It's really difficult to know how effective these policies are. Hungary has particularly been prominent in trying to promote them. There has been some uptick in the Hungarian fertility rate, but it's still way below the level that will be needed for long-term replacement in Hungary. Russia has tried and appeared initially to succeed and then failed. You can throw an awful lot of money at it, but ultimately if people's values and principles and above all priorities are not that family formation, getting married, having children, or not necessarily getting married, depending on the society. But anyway, if people don't put childbearing and child rearing and family formation at the forefront of their priorities, then it's very difficult for governments. And then it really is about values and about changes of attitude, where government can nudge, but it can't really legislate.
Europe.cgtn.com has all of the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take of some of them.
A new bullet train reached speeds exceeding 450 kilometers per hour in test runs on the Fuzhou-Xiamen high-speed railway. The 2023 World Artificial Intelligence Conference opened in Shanghai with 400 companies, 30 AI models and 4 Nobel Prize and Turing Award laureates. A joint satellite project between China and Egypt is back in China ahead of the launch later this year. An assembly line in Guangzhou produced the country's 20 millionth new energy vehicle, a landmark figure in the drive for sustainability. The Mini 3 Links ferry service between mainland China and Taiwan welcomed its 20 millionth passenger since opening in 2001. And giant panda twins He Hua and He Ye celebrated their second birthday at the Chengdu Panda Base in Sichuan province.
All that and more at CGTN.com.
Now, China's crayfish capital has thousands of restaurants, all offering diners a chance to enjoy the local speciality.
But one business is trying to stand out from the crowd, serving up a new variety of the shellfish, which brings straight from breeding farms to its kitchens. Our correspondent Chen Tong reports.
8 o'clock in the morning. 4 boxes of a new variety of crayfish are departing from the breeding center. After 2 hours' drive, they've arrived at their destination, the provincial capital of Jiangsu, Nanjing. This is the direct sale store owned by the Xuyi Crayfish Group, which just opened this March. This is also so far the only store where diners can enjoy the new breed.
This signage here is proudly telling people it's the first direct sale store owned by Xuyi Crayfish Group. But apart from this sign, the decorations here have no difference with other franchise ones.
The store manager told me it's not actively telling diners the crayfish here are the new breed either.
Our store name is Xu Xiaolong, Xuyi Crayfish Nanjing Direct Sale Store, which emphasizes the 2 words of direct sale. Our crayfish are freshly shipped from Xuyi every morning.
In the little county of Xuyi, there are some 2,000 crayfish restaurants. Some are franchise ones and some are little private shops. Why did the state-owned Xuyi Crayfish Group suddenly decide to open a low-profile restaurant and run it by itself?
We want to start from Nanjing and then spread it to large cities because there are more consumers in large cities with better promotion possibilities. So we wanted to begin from large cities.
The key word is promotion. Xuyi has a long history of breeding crayfish, but is facing fierce competition from another crayfish production center in China's central province of Hubei, Qianjiang, which has a more mature crayfish processing industry. The Xuyi Crayfish Group says it's not planning to open any direct sales stores in Xuyi, only in large cities. It's obvious that a direct sales store does not seek to replace existing restaurants, but only to let more people in China know that Xuyi has a crayfish specialty.
Feeling hungry after watching that. That was our correspondent Chen Tong reporting.
Yes, well, in the week, BYD and Tesla reported record sales. We're looking at the future of electric vehicles. Professor David Bailey from the University of Birmingham says that while China, Europe and the United States are all plugging in, it's going to take a while for the rest of the world to catch up.
Think of global car sales. They are very much focused in North America, Europe, China, Southeast Asia, as well as South Africa. So, you know, if you can get a quick win across those blocks in terms of a transition to electric vehicles, you are bringing down global emissions quite substantially. In other parts of the world, it's going to be a more gradual transition. That's going to depend on the range of electric vehicles increasing much further. It's going to require a much better charging infrastructure. There's also going to be alternative options, I think, in some countries. So whilst I'm critical of the use of synthetic fuels, it may be that, for example, in Brazil, they could continue to use bioethanol, which they can grow, in order to continue to use internal combustion engines for a while longer. So I think that we'll see a variety of different transitions, but quickest transition in North America, Europe and China, with a more gradual transition around the world. And there's going to have to be support for that. This is an expensive business. You know, there's a meeting today about how the world meets its climate targets, and there's going to be a need for the developed countries to help the developing countries make the transition. As part of that, the transition towards EVs needs to be part of the mix. So I think the richer countries have got to help some of the more developing countries make the switch.
And you can see more of that interview with Professor David Bailey from the University of Birmingham on The Agenda with Juliette Mann this weekend here on CGTN.
And more cars news for you. Finally, it's the end of the road for the Ford Fiesta, one of the best-loved cars in Europe, certainly one of the best-selling, as the last model rolls off the production line in Cologne in Germany. This brings to an end 47 years of production of the car, which has sold over 22 million vehicles around the world. It was at one time the UK's all-time best-selling car and #1 selling model for about 12 years, from 2009. But Ford says it's cutting production to free up factory space as it moves to electric vehicles.
Well, they really were everywhere, weren't they?
They were. End of an era.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very sad.
Well, the headlines again here on CGTN. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, on her visit to China, strikes a conciliatory tone, saying the United States wants to diversify rather than decouple from Beijing.
Our other headlines: the United States economy creates the smallest number of jobs in more than 2 years, and a sign the interest rate rises may be starting to bite.
And Ukraine applies to join the Trans-Pacific Trade Group, made up of countries around the Pacific Rim, including Canada, New Zealand, Mexico and Japan.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Yes, thank you very much. There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
And coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live, but we'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.